Hi everyone, welcome to another tutorial for Com1. This tutorial is going to be an introductory video into how to use Photoshop. So mainly just the layout of Photoshop and a couple of tricks and tools that you can use in the program. So once you open Photoshop, which you can get the same way you got Illustrator through the Creative Cloud program, once you open it up, you'll presented with something that looks like this. So this is obviously very similar to the Illustrator kind of homepage, where you've got a whole bunch of recent files that you've been working on, and also kind of a few options to create new files. So the first thing I'm going to do when I open up Photoshop is I'm going to go create new to create a new kind of artboard like an Illustrator. So just like Illustrator, you're presented with a whole series of different options. This is the most recently used artboard panel. So for a series of kind of preset types, you can go over to the Print tab. You go View All Presets, and there's a whole series of page sizes here. And very similarly to Illustrator, you've got the option to create your own sizes as well. Just for this, I'm just going to go and create an A3 page. So make sure that you're working in millimeters. I'm going to go in the portrait orientation, and down here where it says the resolution, I'm just going to change it up to 300, so really, really high resolution. So this is 300 pixels per inch resolution. Yeah, inch for some reason is the main form of measurement that we use for that. 8-bit RGB color mode, that's fine. I would probably actually change that to CMYK because we're going to be printing our files, and then everything else is fine. So that's kind of the basics. Then I'm just going to go create. And when you open it up, again, it's very similar to Illustrator, where just going clockwise around the page. Starting in the middle, we've got our big artboard here, which works very similarly to Illustrator, though there are some key differences, which I'll go through. Then you've got your basic tools. So this is where all the drawing tools and editing tools are. For Photoshop, then up the top here, you've got a whole series of different options, and I think I actually want to go, yeah, so kind of in like an Illustrator, you've got a whole series of preset options. For this, I'm just going to stick to essentials for now because I don't want anything too complicated. So there's some editing tools up here, and then you've got your layers panel, as well as some kind of colors and swatches panels up here. So all very similar to Illustrator. The key differences between Photoshop and Illustrator is that Photoshop is a pixel-based program, whereas Illustrator is a vector-based program. So Rhino is also a vector-based program. That's why the line work from Rhino comes through so well into Illustrator. So Illustrator and Rhino are really great line work editing tools, but Photoshop is not fantastic at editing line work, but what it is really good for is editing images or photos. So that's primarily what we would expect you to be doing in Photoshop. So to go through how the whole program works and how you might begin to edit some photos, the first thing you want to know, and maybe the most key difference aside from the pixels-based programming, is how the layers panel works. So you'll notice that there's a background which is locked. That's the kind of the preset layer you get when you open Photoshop. And just like in Illustrator, if I hit the little I button next to the layer, that layer will disappear. So if I go ahead and click the I button here, I can't because it's locked. That's the first thing. So to unlock the layer, I need to just click on that padlock and that's going to unlock. If I want to relock that layer, I just click that little padlock up here once the layer is selected, and that'll lock the layer again. So let's just unlock it. So just to show you kind of again how Photoshop sort of works, if I hit the little I button, you'll notice that my artboard has become kind of this tiled gray and white hatch. That's telling me that there is no background on this Photoshop file. And so when I turn this back on, it becomes white again. What this layer is essentially just a white square that covers the whole artboard in Photoshop. And if I turn that off, then it's telling me that there's actually nothing on my screen anymore. It's going to be transparent. So where in Illustrator you've always got a white background as if you're drawing on a page, Photoshop doesn't necessarily have a background all the time. And I'll explain how that works a little bit more in a moment. The other thing you want to know is that layers are kind of more concrete, if you like, in Photoshop, whereas they're very fluid in Illustrator. You can move things between layers very easily. The layers in Photoshop are far more kind of rigid. And so to show you what I mean, if I go down here to on the layers panel and go create a new layer, this is called layer 1. So I can begin to draw on this layer, and it does work kind of similarly to Illustrator, but again, there are some key differences. So one of the main tools in Photoshop is the brush tool. So that's just over here in the layers panel. If I click on this and click on brush tool, my cursor will change to this circle to indicate that I've got the brush tool selected. What I can do is I can right click with the brush tool and I can change my brush settings. So right clicking is kind of much more kind of dominant function in Photoshop. So I can resize my brush, and it uses a pixel based measurement, which is actually relevant for Photoshop because it uses pixels. And this hardness just represents the softness, or I guess the hardness of the edge of that brush, which will make sense. So in a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set that to 100%, and I'm going to set my size to about 70. So just hit enter when you're done. And now if I just click my mouse and I just draw, so I've got kind of an orange color here, I can draw on that layer. Now to show what I mean about pixel-based program, if I zoom into my line, you can see the closer and closer I get, the more pixelated my line becomes. And if I get really close, you can see that this this brush stroke is actually just a whole series of tiled pixels. So if I go back to my brush tool, hitting just B on my keyboard there, right click, and if I change my brush down to 1 pixel, then you can see that my brush here is just 1 pixel wide. So that's actually what the pixel measurement is referring to when I'm resizing my brush. And this is also why the program is not very good for doing line work, because while obviously this would be fine to print out, if you're doing really complex line work, it's very hard to go and edit this line, because the only way I can edit it is to maybe pull out the eraser tool. So if I press E on my keyboard or select this tool over here, I can begin to erase the line work I just drawn. So if I right click again, I can change the size of my eraser to kind of 40, change the hardness to 100%, and I can go through and I can start to erase that line. So while that's really great for kind of editing this type of line work, if I was doing a plan or something, it'd be very difficult to constantly be changing the line work around on the plan. And then if I go back to my brush tool, I'm just going to right click and change the size back up to about 70. If I change my hardness down to 0% and I draw, you can see that really soft edge that's being created by my brush. So now if I zoom in, you can see that there's a lot more variation in the pixels around the edge of that line. So if I scroll really close, you can see the kind of the tiled pixel nature of the brush. And yeah, you can see that there's a lot more variation, and that's how it's getting that kind of that faded view of the brush there. So to explain how kind of layers work, if I go over to my move tool, which is a bit different to the direct selection and selection tools in Illustrator, if I just draw another line, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another layer. So I'm going to call this layer orange lines. I'm going to create this layer, I'm going to call this black lines. If I just change the color that I'm drawing with, so over here, similar to Illustrator, if I just click on that little block there, or if I hit Shift X rather, that'll flip, and now I'm going to be drawing in black. Hit the brush tool, and I can draw a black line, and I can change that hardness to around 50%, and see it's a little bit more clear, back up to 100%. It's really clear. So if I go to my move tool and let's say I want to move one of these lines around, when you've got the move tool selected, you want to have when you've got the move tool selected, you want to have the auto select ticked on typically. And for now, I'm going to leave that connected to layer. So with the move tool selected, if I try and drag this, you can see that both of those lines are moving together. That's because I'm moving that whole orange lines layer. So objects aren't individual objects in Photoshop. They're all stuck together on their layers. So if I move the black line work around, that is telling me that that entire layer is just these collection of line works here. So the lines don't have kind of autonomy in Photoshop because they're not really lines. They're just a collection of colored pixels. So everything you draw on into each individual layer, and I can see I can even move my background layer around, and that's why that was locked in the first place. So I'm actually just going to go back and relock my background layer. Good. So that's kind of the basics of kind of how Photoshop operates. To show you even more about how this works is if I select the orange lines, you can see that that layer highlights. If I then press on my keyboard Command T or Control T if you're on PC, I get this little bounding box around those lines. And I can actually begin to resize, and if I hold Shift, I can really manipulate how those lines appear on the page. And I don't even need to select my line work to do this. If I click on the black lines layer and I go Command T, then that's Control Transform, I think is why it's called T. I can then select the black line work, and that's going to be able to be manipulated, and holding Shift I can start to rotate it. So again, that's kind of how layers kind of work on Photoshop. So a little bit different there to Illustrator. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete these layers now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you kind of how or why Photoshop is such a great program for editing photos. So if I go onto Google Chrome, onto the internet, I'm just going to download this map of Blackwater Bay. So I'm just going to go right click, save as, and just save it to my downloads, and I'm just going to call it Blackwater Bay map. Good, that's downloaded. Then if I go back to Photoshop, I want to bring this map into Photoshop to start to edit it. So if I go over to File and I go Place, you can see that there's two options here. There's Place Embedded and there's Place Linked. This will make a bit more sense when I start going through the InDesign program, but for now, let's use the Place Embedded method. What that's going to do is it's going to save whatever we are working on to our Photoshop file. Whereas if you start to place linked images, you have to kind of keep the images packaged with your file. It's a bit more complicated. So for now, let's go with Place Embedded. So what I want to place, I can go there, I can place my Blackwater Bay map as a JPEG, that's fine, just go place. Good. Now that image will be placed into Photoshop. You can see it's a little bit pixelated at the moment. That's because it's kind of loading in. So once I've decided that, yep, that's the image I want to load in, if I press enter, it'll kind of change the resolution a little bit more. Now, in the same way that I could kind of move those lines around, I can move this map around my page, which is good. But I can't really edit it at the moment. So if I get the eraser tool, it's got a little strike through on my mouse, and I can't actually edit the photo. That's because I need to rasterize the image first. So at the moment, Photoshop is kind of telling me that this is a image that's linked to my file, but it's kind of reading it as a JPEG. Whereas I want to kind of change it so that it's reading as just pixels, which again, might make a bit more sense later. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the Blackwater Bay map layer. And what that gives me is a whole series of options that I can start to mess with my layer. But I'm not going to really do too much yet. I'm just going to go over to rasterize layer. So right click on the layer and go to rasterize layer. That's done. You can see the little thumbnail on the layer has changed a little bit. And nothing's actually changed about the image except that now when I press the E command for the eraser tool, I can actually start to erase parts of my map and rub them out and start to kind of play with the map a little bit more. I don't really want to start to just cut things out. I'd rather start to edit the colors and start to kind of do some cool things with this. So some of the cool tricks you can do is you can play with the hue and saturation of a map. So to do that, what I want to do is I want to make sure that the Blackwater Bay map layer is selected on my panel over here. Then at the top, I want to go to Image. Then I want to go to Adjustments, and I want to go to Hue and Saturation. So that's going to open up a little panel here. And what this is kind of the color profile of the image that I'm kind of working on with the layer. And by dragging these sliders around, I can begin to manipulate the appearance of my map. So if I change the hue, it's going to change the kind of the overall color grading of the map. So I can start to give it a more blue hue. I can make it green, back to its original yellow, more red, and all the way to more blue again. Then I can also start, so if I just change it back to 0, I can also start to play with the saturation. So if I go down, the colors slowly become more and more faded till eventually they're going to become completely black and white. So if you ever want to change an image to be black and white, this is the best way to do it. There is a black and white image function on Illustrator, but it's not nearly as good as the Photoshop function. So by extension, by turning the saturation down to -100, I can also turn it to +100 and highly oversaturate my image. But for now, I'm just going to leave it as black and white, so back down to 0. Then lastly, I can also manipulate the darkness and the brightness of the image itself. So this is just going to change the kind of the black and white grading of the image. So if I go all the way to 100, it should just be almost a completely black image. And if I go slowly back to +100, it's going to be almost an entirely white image, which kind of has some nice kind of features. So maybe I'll just make this image slightly more bright. There we go. Okay, good. The next thing I'd want to show you is the ability to change the opacity of things. So opacity doesn't work the same as it does in Illustrator, where I could select an object and then change the individual opacity of that object. Opacity typically works best when you edit the layer of something in Photoshop. So if I go to my layers, if I select my Blackwater Bay map layer, up the top here, I can start to change the opacity of my map. So I can start to bring this down, and that's going to create a more opaque map. So again, if I had something underneath my map, like a black line, you can see that that black line is quite visible in the middle of my map. When I turn the opacity back up again, that black line becomes more and more faint. So very similar to Illustrator, but just slightly different, where I'm editing the layer rather than the individual object. Just going back, so just undoing what I've done, I want to bring the colors of my map back. So just going to go Control Z there until I get my colors back. Another really fantastic tool on Photoshop is the Magic Wand tool. So let's say I wanted to start to cut out objects from this map. In fact, I want to just cut out the water of this map, and I want to start to use that in one of my drawings. So I've got two options, or actually I've got quite a few options here. The first option is I could get the eraser tool, make sure my image is rasterized, and I could go through and I could start to cut out the water of my map. And I could go all the way around, and then I can really zoom in, and I could start to really intricately cut away at the bay. And I could keep doing this, changing my brush size, and get really close and start to cut away until all that's left eventually is just the bay. That's one way. Another way you could cut out the water of this map is to use the Magic Wand tool. So if I press W on my keyboard, I'll go over here to the Magic Wand tool. What this does is it selects a single color that it's reading on any kind of image that you choose. So if I use the magic wand tool and I select the blue of this water, you can see that the kind of the whole blue area has this kind of buzzing kind of outline. This means that this area of my map is selected, as it's kind of reading this as a single piece of color. So this means that this part of my layer is the only part of the layer that I can edit right now. So if I hit the eraser tool and I start to erase the map, you can see that nothing is being erased when I'm clicking. But if I move my eraser over the bay, you can see that the contents of the bay are starting to get erased, which would be great if I wanted to cut out the bay from the map. But I actually wanted just the bay, so not to cut the bay out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo what I did, press W on my keyboard to go back to the magic wand tool, and then as I hover over the kind of highlighted area, I'm going to right click and I'm going to go select inverse. This is going to reverse whatever I've selected from my map. So select inverse, and now you probably won't notice much difference, but what's happened is everything else except for the bay is now selected. And I know that because the entire outside of my image is starting to buzz with this kind of highlighted kind of tool. So now if I select the E for my eraser tool and I start to erase, then everything outside of the bay is going to start to get erased. And you can see that some of the lettering on the inside of the bay is highlighted. I'm aware of that, and I just want to avoid cutting out those letters because I want to keep those letters on the inside of my bay. So if I go through and I just erase every other part of my map, just give me a second, you can see this is a lot faster and a lot more precise than if I had done this manually. So almost finished. Good. So now all I'm left with is the bay. So if I go back to my magic wand tool by pressing W and I go Command D for deselect, then that's going to deselect. And now all I'm left with is the cutout of the bay. It's not quite perfect, and maybe you want to touch this up a little bit. So to touch it up, I just hit the eraser tool and just delete maybe some of those kind of imperfect bits that didn't quite make it. But essentially what you've got is a really, really precise, really, really quick cutout of a single kind of object from a map. And I can start to use this, for my map or for kind of the next exercise, so on and so forth. So that's a really, really useful tool. Then I could also go on and go to the image adjustments, hue and saturation setting, and I could maybe change that water to be black and white. And I can start to edit just that part of it. However, maybe I've cut out my bay and then I'm going, oh, but I actually wanted another part of my map, but that map has now been erased and there's no way of getting it back. So there's actually a way I can start to edit this image without having to permanently delete parts of the image when I erase them. So if I just go backspace, just want to bring the rest of the map back. You can see myself. So there we go. And I'm just going to go back to the magic wand tool and deselect. So what I can do is I can actually start to cut away the map, but not actually properly delete it. And I can create a clipping mask of my map to do that, which works, again, very similarly to how it does in Illustrator, which we went through the other day. So if I select the bay with the magic wand tool, you can see, okay, so sometimes this will happen where depending on where you choose, it's going to start to read other colors that kind of mixed in. So maybe if I clicked over here, it's actually reading a bit of the tan and a bit of the blue because the map isn't quite perfect. So when you're selecting an area, make sure it's kind of a nicer area, which is like a more blue color, and that's going to help me select just what I want. There we go. So if I wanted to start to cut out this map and not actually delete everything else, what I could do is I could select the layer that I've got. I've highlighted my bay. I'm going to go just actually unhighlight that bay first. What I want to do is I want to select my layer, and then down the bottom here where it says add layer mask, I want to click on this little button here. When I do that, a little thumbnail appears on my layer. This is kind of like a piece of trace paper that I'm placing over my layer. And it's a bit strange, but it operates with black and white brushes. So what this means is if I select a brush and I make sure it's black, I think, and I draw over it, you can see that I'm starting to erase the map, but I'm not actually erasing the map. I'm just kind of painting it with a mask, which Photoshop is kind of saying is invisible, which I know is a little bit complicated, but what that means is, if you can see here, you can see where I've kind of colored in the black, and that kind of matches the pattern I've created on my map here. If I right click on that, I can go disable layer mask. So I can kind of turn it off, and then the rest of the map will appear. Then I can right click on it, I can go enable layer mask, and that same part of the map will disappear again, which can be really useful if, for example, I'm doing something like this. So if I just delete that layer mask, I don't want it anymore, it'll disappear. If I go back and go create layer mask again, and I'm operating on the layer mask over here, then if I select the magic wand tool, highlight the bay, select the brush tool, make sure I'm drawing in black, and then I erase. Sometimes this is a bit strange, I'm not sure exactly why it does. Oh, that's right, because I haven't selected inverse. So if I select the bay, right click and go select inverse again, just like I did before, then go to the brush command, I can actually draw over the rest of my map. You can see in my little layer mask that that brushwork is appearing. So go. Just erase. Oops, I lost a few of the letters there. Actually, this is going to be a good exercise. Good. So now the whole bay is erased, and I can go Command deselect to get rid of that. Then my bay is back again. I can actually start to kind of erase parts of my layer mask to bring parts of the map back. So you can see here that, oh, I've actually lost my layers. That's really annoying. What I can do is, I think if I change the color to white, so go Shift X to switch that color back. Yeah, I can start to draw back parts of the layer mask, which is actually deleting the mask and revealing parts of the image back again. So to make that kind of more clear, if I start to draw over here, I can start to draw back parts of the image, which is a really, really good way to be using Photoshop. It means that you're not actually deleting any part of the image, and at any point you can go back and start to so white is to kind of erase the layer mask, and black is to create more of it. I can actually start to re-edit and make sure my images aren't getting kind of messed up. That's the last thing you can do that I might show you today is you can also start to add kind of lots of other cool effects in Photoshop. So I'm going to deselect my layer mask by just clicking back onto my normal image here. So that's the layer mask there. Again, I can disable that and bring the rest of the image back, or I can right click and enable it again, and that'll kind of re-enable. But if you ever want to start to edit the image again, click back onto the layer thumbnail, and that's going to allow you to edit the image directly. So now if I start to erase the image, that'll actually be deleted from the image. So with the image kind of parent layer selected, what I can do is I can start to add kind of a few more interesting tools and start to change the colors and sort of the textures of this image a bit more. So if I go over to filter, I can start to add lots of other different types of effects to the photos. And one of those is adding noise, which kind of is like a speckledy texture, which is kind of fun. So if I go over and I go filter, noise, add noise, you can see that it's an effect that kind of creates this kind of speckledy impression on the image. And if I just reduce that back down to kind of a very small percentage, it's a nice kind of texture if you want to start to manipulate the overall appearance of an image. And the distribution will change depending on, so uniform is a more kind of gridded uniform style noise, and then Gaussian is a bit more of a chaotic random style. So you can see those two kinds of aesthetics there. And you can also change it from monochromatic to be kind of color-based noise, but monochromatic typically looks a bit better. So that's just black and white is what that means. So if I go OK, then I've now kind of edited the image to look a bit more kind of speckledy. And what's even cool about this is if I deselect my layer mask, I've actually added noise to the whole image. But again, the layer mask is kind of hiding, if you like, the rest of the image at the moment. So that's really fantastic. Now, the last thing I want to show you how to do in Photoshop is, like I mentioned, Photoshop is kind of placed this white background here for us, and we actually don't necessarily need this. So just to show you how this operates, if I want to export this as an image, so let's say I just want to export the water of my bay as its own individual image and maybe bring that back into Illustrator. What I can do is I can go File, Export, Export As, and I can go, so change it to a PNG, that's good. These settings are fine. I'm just going to go Export. I'm going to change it to Black Wattle Bay. It's actually more like Roselle Bay, but that's fine. Go into my downloads and save it there. Now, if I go to Illustrator, which I've already got open, if I go Create New, open an A3 page, make it Portrait, go Open, I can bring that PNG in. So I'm going to go File, and I'm going to go Place, Blackwater Bay PNG. If I start to bring that in, I can place it there. You'll notice that, oh, the PNG is placed with this big white background. That's kind of annoying. I just wanted my bay. I didn't want this whole thing. What I can do is I can go back to Photoshop. I can actually turn off the background layer. And you can see that now that's changed back to that kind of gray and white tiled square background. What I can now do is I can go File, Export, Export As. PNG, that's fine. It's just loading up. And you can see here that now the preview image is actually missing the white background as well. That's good. And if I go Export again, I'm just going to export it over the Blackwater Bay PNG. Go Replace. That's good. Go back to Illustrator. This is actually a really cool feature of the Adobe program. So this is the same file that I saved over. So now this is actually updating manually, which is really cool, but might be a bit confusing for this next bit. If I go, would I like to update this? I'm going to go yes. That white background has actually disappeared, which is fantastic. You can still see that it's kind of got this large bounding box, which is a little bit annoying, but it's very easy to fix in Illustrator. So it's got a transparent background, which is really great. So I can move it around and do whatever I want with it. But I actually want this to be a slightly kind of, the bounding box to be kind of closer to the bay itself. So what I can do is I can go Crop Image in Illustrator. And that'll give me kind of a new boundary I can draw off my image. So I'm just going to draw and make that really close to the size of the bay. Go Enter. And now I've got a little cutout of Blackwater Bay from my map, which is a little bit edited and kind of fun. So now I can use that in my maps or however way I want. So obviously there's a lot more you can do with Photoshop, but this is just one of the cool little tricks you can do with it. We're going to be releasing a few more videos on how to use Photoshop, but that's kind of the intro, and that'll probably get you started doing a cool few little things in the program. Okay, all the best. I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you next week. Bye.